Chapter 1. The Illusion of the Perfect Childhood. Think about someone you probably know, maybe it is you, who works relentlessly, achieves every goal set before them, and still feels like they are somehow falling behind. Picture this person sitting quietly on a balcony in the early hours of the morning, a warm cup of chai in their hands, listening to the distant rhythmic hum of city traffic waking up. To the outside world, their life is a masterpiece of success. They are the pride of their family, the one everyone points to as the ultimate example of doing things right. They excel in their career, they are admired by their peers, and they seem to navigate the heavy responsibilities of life with an effortless grace. But in the quiet solitude of that morning when the laptop is closed and there is no one left to perform for, a profound and terrifying emptiness creeps in. Behind the brilliant facade lurks a heavy, nameless depression, a lingering sense of self-alienation, and a haunting whisper that despite all their achievements, their life lacks true meaning. When such individuals finally seek help, they almost always bring with them a fiercely protected narrative about their past. If you ask them about their early years, they will tell you with absolute certainty that they had a wonderful, happy, and protected childhood. They will recount how they were praised for their maturity, how they were practically self-sufficient by the time they could walk, and how they responsibly helped care for their younger siblings without ever causing a fuss. They speak of their parents with deep understanding, often rushing to defend them. If there was ever a moment they felt misunderstood or hurt as children, they quickly take the blame, assuming they simply failed to express themselves properly. They recount their earliest memories with an eerie detachment, showing absolutely no sympathy for the small, vulnerable child they once were. Their history is heavily repressed, neatly packaged into an illusion of perfection that is incredibly easy to maintain because the true emotional reality has been completely locked away. To understand why this happens, we have to look closely at the invisible emotional currents that flow between a parent and a child. Every infant is born with a fundamental, non-negotiable need. The need to be seen, respected, and mirrored exactly as they are at any given moment. This means their joy, their sudden terror, their frustration, and their messy, inconvenient sadness all need to be met with a calm, accepting presence. When a child is allowed to express their true feelings without the fear of losing their caregiver's love, they naturally build a strong, unquestioned sense of self. But for this to happen, the parents themselves must have grown up in a similar climate of emotional security. Tragically, many parents did not. Many adults are walking through the world carrying the heavy, unacknowledged wounds of their own emotional deprivation. Throughout their lives, they unknowingly search for the one thing they were denied, a person who is completely focused on them, who takes them seriously, and who will never abandon them. Because this unconscious need is so vast and unfulfilled, it seeks substitute gratification. And the most readily available, utterly captive audience for this substitute gratification is their own newborn child. A tiny infant is completely dependent on their caregivers for survival. They are like a fragile plant that must turn toward the sun to live, and they will muster every instinctual resource they have to avoid losing the adults who keep them alive. Let us imagine how this actually unfolds in a real life. Imagine a bright, deeply intuitive little boy. He is highly sensitive to the shifting moods in his home. His mother is a deeply loving woman, but beneath her outward capability, she carries a fragile, anxious insecurity. She relies entirely on her environment to feel stable. One afternoon, the boy falls and scrapes his knee. He is frightened and wants to cry out, to be held and comforted, but as the tears well up, he looks at his mother's face. He does not see a calm harbor. Instead, he sees her panic, her distress, and a subtle but unmistakable withdrawal. He intuitively registers a terrifying truth. His pain is hurting her. His normal, childlike need is destabilizing the very person he depends on for his existence. So, in a split second of survival instinct, he swallows his tears. He forces a brave smile. He tells her he is perfectly fine. The mother sighs with immense relief, her face softening into a radiant, approving smile. She praises him for being such a strong, brave, and good boy. In that exact moment, a profound psychological transaction takes place. The boy has discovered his role. He has incredible, unconscious antennae that allow him to perceive exactly what his mother needs him to be to maintain her emotional equilibrium. He learns that his true feelings, his fear, his neediness, his anger, are dangerous, but his ability to comfort, to be quiet, to be the good child, secures her love. This role guarantees him a measure of existential security. As he grows, he perfects this ability. He becomes the emotional caretaker of the family. He anticipates conflicts before they happen and smooths them over. He becomes the confidant, the tiny adult who never demands anything but gives everything. But this love he has secured is actually a form of unconscious exploitation. He is praised and admired for his extraordinary talents, for his reliability, for being the absolute joy of his parents' lives. But none of this admiration is directed at his true self. It is directed at the flawless performance he has engineered to keep his world from falling apart. The boy grows into a man who continues to overachieve, to read the room, to mold himself into whatever his partner, his boss, or his society demands. He is a master of adaptation. Yet because he had to cut off all that was alive, spontaneous, and inconvenient within himself to survive, he feels entirely hollow. The emptiness is not a metaphor. It is the real, agonizing void left behind when a child is forced to abandon their true self. This is the great tragedy of the gifted, sensitive child. They are not broken because they are ungrateful or because they demand too much of the world. They are broken because they demanded nothing at all. They traded their inner reality for the illusion of a perfect childhood, believing that if they just played the part perfectly, they would finally feel loved. But admiration is a very poor substitute for love. When the drug of grandiosity wears off, when there is a failure at work, when the applause fades, or when they are simply left alone with their thoughts on a quiet morning, the darkness rushes back in. They are plagued by deep anxiety and crippling guilt because they believe that if they are not useful, they are entirely worthless. To heal, we must first find the courage to look past the beautiful, golden illusion of our past. We have to understand that the intense, invisible pressure to be the perfect child was not a gift, but a heavy chain. The journey toward a meaningful life does not begin with more achievements or better performances. It begins with the difficult, necessary task of recognizing the child who was left behind, waiting patiently in the shadows, hoping that one day someone would finally let them speak. Chapter 2. The Price of Being Good. There is a strange, silent phenomenon that occurs in the most well-behaved, accommodating people we know. Consider the child who never caused trouble. The one who sat quietly during long, chaotic family gatherings, who never demanded attention when their parents were stressed, who graciously shared everything, and who always seemed to understand the adult world better than the adults themselves. We look at these children and applaud their maturity. We call them old souls. But beneath this miraculous compliance lies a profound and invisible sacrifice. The price of being good, of perfectly adapting to the emotional needs of the environment, is the systematic suppression of the child's own vibrant, messy, and vital emotional world. To survive an environment where their true emotions are inconvenient, a child masters the devastating art of not experiencing their own feelings. Imagine a young girl growing up in a bustling household where her mother is perpetually overwhelmed by the heavy demands of life. The mother relies deeply on this eldest daughter to be her steady rock. One evening, a younger sibling breaks a cherished item and the mother is on the verge of a total emotional breakdown. The young girl feels a surge of intense anxiety, perhaps even fierce anger at her sibling, but her acute emotional radar detects her mother's terrifying fragility. She realizes in a fraction of a second that if she expresses her own distress, the entire household will collapse. So she takes a deep breath, buries her panic, and calmly begins to clean up the mess. She speaks in a soothing voice, comforting her mother and guiding her sibling away. She does not just hide her fear, she effectively deletes it from her conscious experience. She is not pretending to be calm, she forces herself to actually become the calmness her mother desperately needs. This is how the rich, complex tapestry of human emotion is unraveled. When a child realizes that their anger, their jealousy, their profound sadness, or their desperate need for help will cause their parent to pull away, become defensive, or fall apart, the child is faced with an impossible choice. For a helpless infant or toddler, the loss of a caregiver's love is not just a psychological injury, it is perceived as physical death. So the child makes the only choice they can. They amputate their own feelings. They cannot even allow themselves to feel these dangerous emotions in secret because hiding them requires too much energy and carries the terrifying risk of accidental discovery. Instead, they simply stop feeling them altogether. Yet these banished emotions do not evaporate into thin air. A feeling is a physical event, a rush of energy and neurochemistry. When it is denied expression, it does not disappear. It goes into exile. It is stored deep within the tissues of the body, locked away in the cells as pure, unarticulated information waiting for a trigger. The child grows into an adult who is remarkably even-tempered, who never gets angry, who never feels the sting of envy, and who handles crisis with robotic efficiency. They might even describe their childhood as entirely peaceful and free of pain. They can vividly recall the exact shade of the monsoon clouds from when they were 6 years old, or the rich smell of rain on the dry earth, but they genuinely cannot remember feeling a single ounce of jealousy when their baby brother was born and absorbed all of their parents' attention. Their memories are perfectly sanitized. This emotional amputation leads directly to the creation of the as-if personality. This person walks through life acting as if they are experiencing reality, but there is a thick pane of frosted glass between them and the world. They develop an uncanny ability to read exactly what is expected of them in any situation, whether in a high-stakes boardroom, a romantic relationship, or a social gathering, and they fuse so completely with this expectation that their true self is entirely eclipsed. They become the perfect employee, the ever-understanding partner, the tireless friend. But because they are living a relentless performance tailored entirely to everyone else's needs, they are constantly haunted by a pervasive sense of emptiness and homelessness. They feel that if people knew who they really were, they would be rejected, completely unaware that they do not even know who they really are themselves. Think of a man who has spent 30 years building an incredibly successful enterprise. He is the ultimate provider, a pillar of his community, always ready with a charming smile and a solution to every problem. Yet, he suffers from recurring, terrifying dreams where he is wandering through a sprawling, empty house, looking for a room that does not exist. Or perhaps he dreams that he is standing at the edge of a vibrant festival, entirely invisible to the celebrating crowds. His unconscious mind is trying to tell him the truth. In order to be the golden child, to preserve the love of his demanding parents, he had to kill off his own spontaneity, his own rage, and his own desires. He killed a vital part of himself, and his dreams are mourning a death that his waking mind refuses to acknowledge. This is the devastating cycle of mutual dependency. The parents, who were themselves emotionally deprived, found a substitute source of comfort and security in the child's perfectly constructed false self. The child, having never been allowed to build their own internal security through the natural trial and error expression of true emotions, becomes fundamentally dependent on external validation. They move from depending on their parents' approval to depending on the applause of their colleagues, the admiration of their partners, and eventually the compliance of their own children. They are completely alienated from their true needs, unable to rely on their own internal compass because that compass was smashed a long time ago. They are left wandering in a lost world of feelings, desperately trying to fill an infinite void with achievements, distractions, and intellectualizations, unaware that the only way back home is to finally turn around and face the very pain they have spent a lifetime running from. Chapter 3. Awakening the Silent Self. There is a powerful and persistent fantasy that many of us carry when we first realize the depths of our own emotional exhaustion. We hope that by seeking help, reading the right philosophy, or working hard enough on ourselves, we might somehow reach back into the past and magically reconstruct the perfect, harmonious childhood we were denied. We long for a pristine paradise of absolute safety and unconditional affection. But true healing does not begin with the pursuit of this unattainable paradise. It begins with the profound, grounding realization that we cannot change a single fact of our history. The past is a locked room, and no amount of wishing will alter what happened inside it. However, the emotional discovery of our own unique truth gives us something far more valuable than a rewritten past. It gives us a new, breathtaking sphere of freedom in the present. The most monumental turning point in a person's life arrives not with a triumphant victory, but with a deeply painful, staggering emotional insight. It is the moment we finally realize that all the love, affection, and admiration we worked so tirelessly to capture was never actually meant for us. The praise we received for our excellent grades, our calm demeanor, our professional successes, or our constant availability was aimed solely at those achievements and conveniences. It was never directed at the real, vulnerable, and messy human being underneath. Imagine a person who has spent decades treating their own soul like a vast, glittering treasury. Early in life, they discovered that whenever they gave away a piece of their own vitality, their boundaries, their joy, their spontaneous needs, they were rewarded with a fleeting smile of approval from their caregivers. Over the years, they finance the emotional stability of everyone around them. They pay for their family's comfort and their partner's peace of mind by carving out and handing over heavy pieces of their own essence. They bankrupt their own spirit to buy the right to be tolerated. But the devastating truth that eventually surfaces is that the love they bought was never for them. It was only for the wealth of compliance they so lavishly gave away. When this realization hits, the carefully constructed walls of the false self begin to crack. The small, lonely child who has been hidden in the dark cellar of the psyche for decades finally wakes up and begins to ask devastating questions. For the first time, this inner voice demands to know, what would have happened if I had appeared before you sad, needy, angry, or furious? Where would your love have been then? Does this mean that you never actually loved me, but only the convenient, quiet, little adult I pretended to be? Have I been cheated out of my entire childhood? These questions are heavy with grief, and asking them brings a tidal wave of pain. Yet this very specific, agonizing grief is the crucible in which true self-respect is forged. Out of this mourning is born a profound new authority and a fierce, protective empathy for one's own fate. As this silent self begins to articulate its presence, the individual starts to break their lifelong habits of compliance. Because their earliest experiences taught them that expressing a true need was a matter of life and death, defending their rights in the present feels incredibly dangerous. They expect to be rejected, punished, or abandoned for simply taking up space. Imagine living your entire life in a transparent glass house, perfectly visible to the demanding eyes of your caregivers. In such a house, you cannot hide anything without being severely reprimanded, unless you bury it deep underground where even you cannot see it. Now, imagine finally daring to dig up the soil and pulling those buried feelings out into the light. It is terrifying, but also exhilarating. The individual is suddenly surprised by emotions they never allowed themselves to recognize. A person who has prided themselves their entire life on being saintly, endlessly tolerant, and beautifully selfless might suddenly feel a sharp, burning flash of anger when a friend is 5 minutes late. They might catch themselves feeling deeply annoyed that they have to share the attention of a mentor or a partner. At first, this feels mortifying. It shatters the foundation of their self-respect, which was built entirely on the illusion that they were always good and completely without needs. They realize how subtly they still try to persuade themselves they are not scared when their heart is pounding, or how they belittle their own anxiety just to keep the peace. But once this door is opened, there is no going back. The awareness of one's own impulses has been aroused, and the vitality that rushes in is undeniable. The person begins to realize that they do not have to put on a cheerful face to manage someone else's mood. They discover that they can be angry and the world will not end. They can rage at an injustice without losing the people who truly matter. They no longer have to frantically seek distractions, working late into the night, endlessly scrolling through phones, or attending meaningless social events. The moment a wave of sadness washes over them, they can simply sit with their sorrow, honoring it as a true expression of their lived experience. This journey is not a homecoming because the warm, validating home they are searching for never actually existed in their past. Instead, it is the magnificent creation of a home within themselves. Where there was once only a fearful emptiness or a frantic, grandiose need to prove their worth, they discover an unexpected wealth of creativity and life. By grieving the childhood they never had, they reclaim the adult life that is rightfully theirs, emerging from the invisible prison of their history as whole, breathing, and fiercely authentic human beings. Chapter 4. The Pendulum of the Ego. We often think of depression purely as a state of heavy, immovable lethargy, a darkness that keeps a person confined to the shadows. But there is another, highly energetic, dazzlingly successful defense against this darkness, the relentless pursuit of grandiosity. It is a profound psychological truth that behind manifest grandiosity, there constantly lurks depression, and behind a depressive mood, there often hides an unconscious sense of a tragic personal history. These are not two different ailments. They are the exact same coin, rapidly flipping through the air, driven by the desperate need to outrun the pain of a lost self. Picture a person walking high above a crowded street on a pair of towering, precarious stilts. From the ground, they look absolutely magnificent. They command awe, respect, and envy as they stride confidently over the heads of ordinary people. But look closer, and you will see the agonizing reality of their existence. Every single step requires immense physical tension, frantic balance, and the terrifying knowledge that one small misstep will result in a devastating fall. This is the inner landscape of the grandiose individual. They do not just want to succeed. They absolutely must excel brilliantly in everything they undertake, or else they will not even attempt it. They are universally admired, and they literally depend on this admiration to survive, using it as a life raft to keep their fragile self-esteem afloat. They look down and feel a bitter envy toward the people walking comfortably on their own two legs, carrying a deep, unacknowledged rage toward the forces that made them so terrified to walk without their stilts. Let us look deeply into the life of such a person. Imagine a top-tier executive, a visionary architect, or a brilliant surgeon who has spent their life accumulating the highest ranks, the most prestigious awards, and the ultimate societal respect. They present an image of flawless control, intellect, and capability. To the world, their confidence appears unshakable. Yet in truth, their self-worth is entirely suspended in mid-air, hanging from a fragile balloon that can be violently punctured by the slightest criticism, a momentary failure, or a missed goal. Because their sense of worth is not rooted in the quiet authenticity of their own internal feelings, but solely in the external possession of certain qualities and achievements, they are never truly free. Where does this desperate, exhausting need to be extraordinary come from? It frequently begins in a family environment that felt a deep sense of social insecurity or lacked prestige in their own community. To compensate for this perceived lack of status, the family makes special efforts to increase their standing, and a specific child is unconsciously assigned a heavy, monumental task. They must guarantee the family honor. This child quickly learns that they are loved only in proportion to how perfectly they fulfill this demanding family ideal through their special talents, their obedience, or their academic brilliance. If they fail, or even falter, they face the agonizing punishment of being cold-shouldered, carrying the crushing, unbearable guilt that they have brought shame upon their people. So, the child learns to perform, and the adult continues the show. But there is a tragic flaw in this survival strategy. The grandiose person is desperately seeking love, but what they capture is admiration. They are not the same thing. Admiration is merely a substitute gratification for the primary, unfulfilled childhood needs of being respected, mirrored, and understood. Because it is only a substitute, it never actually satisfies the deep inner hunger. A person can win a lifetime of international accolades and still confess, in a quiet, unguarded moment, that they have never truly felt what they produced was actually good enough. The pursuit of admiration is insatiable because you can never get enough of something that almost but not quite heals the wound. And what happens when the performance must inevitably pause? This is where the pendulum violently swings to the other extreme. When the drug of grandiosity fails, due to the natural process of aging, the fading of physical beauty, a sudden illness, or simply a shift in economic circumstances, the individual plummets into severe depression. Without the external mirrors of applause and continuous conquest to reflect back their worth, their substitute mirrors shatter. They are left standing completely helpless, feeling as confused and terrified as a small child staring into a mother's face and finding no comforting reflection of themselves, only a cold void. Even at the absolute height of success, this depression is always waiting in the wings. Imagine an incredibly talented stage actor or a renowned musician who has just delivered the performance of a lifetime. The audience rises to their feet, the applause is deafening, and in that moment, the performer experiences a heavenly, intoxicating sense of absolute greatness and almightiness. But the very next morning, alone in their room, an overwhelming wave of emptiness, futility, and even shame washes over them. The triumph of the previous night was secretly functioning as a desperate attempt to satisfy those old, unmet childhood needs to be seen and understood. The success was merely a temporary illusion meant to deny their early frustrations, and like all illusions, it evaporates in the harsh light of day, leaving the old wound completely unhealed. Grandiosity and depression share the exact same foundation. They are both manifestations of the false self, a medal originally won for childhood compliance and achievement. Both states share a severely fragile self-esteem, a paralyzing perfectionism, an enormous fear of losing love, a constant readiness to feel shame, and a profound denial of true, rejected feelings. Whether the person is desperately inflating their balloon with new achievements to stay above the clouds or lying deflated on the ground unable to move, they are trapped in the exact same denial of their childhood reality. True liberation from this exhausting pendulum swing does not come from climbing higher on the stilts, nor does it come from simply managing the symptoms of the inevitable crash. It requires the immense, terrifying courage to step off the stilts entirely. It means mourning the devastating fact that the conditional love they chased for so long can never fill the void in their heart. Only by grieving for the child who was loved merely for their achievements can the adult finally walk on their own 2 feet, free to be ordinary, free to fail, and finally, free to be intensely and beautifully real. Chapter 5. The Mirage of Conditional Love. There is an incredible, exhausting illusion that drives the machinery of so many lives, much like a shimmering mirage in a vast desert. From a distance, it looks exactly like the cool, life-saving water of genuine love. We run toward it, we pour all our energy into reaching it, and we organize our entire existence around securing it. But when we finally arrive, hands cupped and desperate to drink, we find only the dry sand of admiration and conditional approval. We are left thirsty, yet we convince ourselves we have been nourished. This desperate pursuit is not merely a misunderstanding, it is a profound mechanism of survival that begins when a person is too young to know the difference. The heavy, suffocating blanket of depression that so many successful adults wear is not simply a biological misfire. It is, at its very core, the ultimate and complete denial of the self. A denial that was initially demanded of them as a vital condition for their survival. To truly grasp how deep this denial goes, we must look at the quietest, most heartbreaking moments of infancy. Picture a newborn, a fragile life wholly dependent on the giants around them. Every infant is born with a natural, healthy impulse to signal their needs, to cry when they are hungry, to wail when they are cold, and to express pain without hesitation. Now imagine a caregiver who, due to their own unhealed childhood trauma, is terrified by the sound of distress. To this caregiver, a crying baby is not just communicating a need. The cry feels like a harsh accusation, an overwhelming demand that threatens to shatter their fragile equilibrium. Through 1,000 tiny, imperceptible interactions, a stiffening of the arms, a withdrawal of eye contact, an anxious hushing, the infant registers this panic. With a tragic instinctual brilliance, the infant learns to suppress their most basic physical signals. They learn to wait quietly in their crib, to swallow their hunger, and to present a calm, undemanding face to the world. They learn exactly what they are not supposed to feel. When this infant grows into an adult, the disconnection from their own vital signals is absolute. They walk through the world completely out of touch with their own hunger, their own exhaustion, and their own pain. This profound alienation leaves them vulnerable to ideologies, communities, and spiritual groups that unintentionally replicate the very trap of their childhood. Consider a person who joins a highly devoted self-improvement community or a rigorous spiritual sect, desperately seeking the connection they have always lacked. These groups often preach the beautiful, elevated concept of unconditional love, urging their members to forgive every transgression, to love everyone equally, and to suppress any critical or angry thoughts. For the person who was trained since infancy to be perfectly compliant, this feels comfortably familiar. They nod, they smile, and they eagerly suppress their own valid outrage or discomfort, believing they are achieving spiritual enlightenment. But forcing an adult to love unconditionally, to ignore their own boundaries and betray their own judgment, is just another form of hypocrisy. It is the exact same conditional love they experienced as a child, disguised in holy garments. Unconditional love is an absolute necessity for an infant, but demanding it of an adult only deepens their blindness and keeps them separated from their true, discerning self. The most tragic arena where this repressed history plays out is in the transition to parenthood. Imagine a young woman who grew up in a bustling, multi-generational home. She was the absolute pillar of her family, the reliable daughter who managed her younger cousins, anticipated the elders' moods, and kept the household running smoothly while sacrificing her own ambitions. She was crowned the jewel of the family, praised endlessly for her selflessness. Years later, she brings her own firstborn child home. The house is quiet. The ceiling fan hums overhead, and she is finally alone with her baby. But when the infant cries out for nourishment, she does not feel a warm rush of maternal instinct. Instead, as the baby demands her time, her body, and her energy, a terrifying sensation washes over her. She feels suffocated, imprisoned, and deeply resentful. She feels as though this tiny, helpless creature is actively exploiting her, taking advantage of her just as she was taken advantage of her entire life. She looks at her crying child and feels nothing but a desperate urge to run away, followed immediately by a crushing, agonizing wave of guilt for being what she believes is a monstrous mother. But she is not a monster. She is a woman whose natural, instinctual capacity to nurture was violently hijacked when she was a child. Human beings are born with the instinctual programming to protect and deeply enjoy nurturing their young. But this capacity is severely damaged when a person's own childhood is exploited to gratify the needs of their parents. The young mother is not actually angry at her newborn. She is projecting the massive, unacknowledged rage she holds toward the adults who stole her childhood. The baby is simply the first person in her life to make a legitimate, uncompromising demand, and it triggers the lifetime of illegitimate demands she was forced to swallow. The miracle of healing occurs when this woman finally dares to face the truth. Through deep, unflinching reflection, she begins to separate the ghost of her demanding past from the innocent child in front of her. She allows herself to feel the furious indignation she was never permitted to express toward the family that used her. She mourns the little girl who was forced to be an adult. And as she directs her anger where it rightfully belongs, the heavy, suffocating wall around her heart begins to crumble. The exhaustion lifts. For the first time, she looks down at her baby, and the love she had been struggling so desperately to manufacture simply flows in of its own accord. She discovers the profound joy of holding her child without the heavy crown of being the family's savior, realizing that by finally grieving her own lost childhood, she has saved her child's future and reclaimed her own. Chapter 6. Breaking the Inner Prison. We are all familiar with the sudden, suffocating descent of a depressive mood. It often arrives unannounced, like a thick, heavy fog rolling in over the hills just before the monsoon breaks, instantly turning a clear, vibrant day into a grey, oppressive landscape. For most of us, this mood feels like a senseless affliction, a biological error, or a failure of willpower. We scramble to find a distraction, hoping to chase the darkness away with a crowded social event, hours of mindless entertainment, or a fresh burst of frantic work. But what if this heavy, dark mood is not an enemy at all? What if, instead, it is a desperate, urgent signal from the deepest part of your being, trying to tell you that you have just abandoned yourself once again? If we pay very close attention, we can notice that these depressive moods almost always strike with rhythmic regularity the exact moment we suppress a genuine impulse, swallow a valid anger, or force ourselves to perform an action that betrays our true needs. Let us examine how this invisible mechanism operates in our daily lives. Imagine a young woman running a highly demanding textile business. After weeks of relentless, exhausting effort, she finally secures a massive, life-changing contract that secures her company's future. For a few glorious hours, she feels a profound, authentic surge of joy and deep satisfaction. She feels connected to her own brilliance. But as she drives home through the chaotic evening traffic, an old, familiar voice begins to echo in her mind, whispering that she cannot afford to rest, that this victory is not enough, and that she must immediately begin drafting the projections for the next quarter. Obedient to this internal tyrant, she goes home, skips her dinner, opens her laptop, and forces herself to keep working. Almost instantly, the joy evaporates. Her mind goes entirely blank, her body feels made of lead, and a profound, paralyzing depression washes over her. She feels completely empty and alienated from herself, staring at the screen with an agonizing sense of futility. Why did this happen? If she learns to trace the origin of this mood, she will discover that she actively, though unconsciously, provoked it. As a small child, whenever she began to lose herself in spontaneous, imaginative play, truly enjoying her own inner world, her caregivers would abruptly interrupt her, demanding that she stop wasting time and do something sensible and productive instead. Her inner world was violently closed off to her. Because she could not risk a normal reaction, like raging against this unfair interruption, she withdrew her feelings and became depressed. Decades later, she is still doing it to herself. The depression she feels tonight is a loud, blaring signal that her true needs are being suffocated by the demands of an internalized parent. If she can recognize this, if she can allow herself to feel the long-buried anger at how she was treated, the depression will lift, because its defensive function is no longer required. She will finally trust herself to know when it is time to work, and when it is time to rest. This dynamic extends far beyond our individual work habits. It shapes our most intimate relationships and the very communities we choose to join. Consider the social aspect of this hidden depression. Many individuals realize early on that their family environment is emotionally restrictive, and as they grow older, they make a conscious, determined effort to break free. Imagine a young man who leaves his highly traditional, authoritarian family environment to join a radical, hyper-progressive social circle in a different city. He proudly adopts a lifestyle that completely opposes every value his parents held. He marries a fiercely independent, dominant partner, and to prove just how modern and open-minded he is, he allows his partner to constantly belittle and humiliate him in front of their friends. Whenever he feels a sting of mortification or a spark of righteous anger, he forcefully suppresses it, telling himself that jealousy and anger are outdated, primitive emotions. To the outside observer, and even to himself, he appears to be a rebel who has successfully escaped his past. But the suffocating depression that plagues him tells the true story. He has not escaped at all. He has merely changed the scenery of his prison. By suppressing his true feelings to earn the acceptance of his new peer group and his partner, he is sacrificing his true self all over again. He is perfectly recreating the passive, submissive dynamic he witnessed in his own childhood home, transferring his absolute obedience from his parents to his new social system. The depression will not leave him until he realizes that true autonomy is not found by simply adopting the opposite of our parents' values. True freedom is rooted solely in the awareness and acceptance of our own genuine needs and feelings. The inner prison we build to contain our unexpressed childhood emotions is a fortress of incredible strength. The walls of this prison have to be immensely thick because the prisoner they are holding back, the raw, intense, unbridled emotion of a child, is incredibly powerful. A child experiences fear, rage, and grief with an absolute, world-shattering intensity that most adults can scarcely comprehend. Because these feelings were too dangerous to express in a home that required compliance, they were locked away. But living as the warden of your own internal prison is an exhausting, deadening existence that halts all further emotional growth. Dismantling this prison is the true work of an authentic life. It is crucial to understand that it is not the beautiful, pleasant, or socially acceptable feelings that will give you the keys to your freedom. It is precisely the emotions you have fought against the hardest, the feelings of being petty, jealous, helpless, demanding, resentful, and profoundly lonely that hold your deliverance. When we finally allow ourselves to experience these forbidden feelings, we realize that they will no longer destroy us. We are no longer helpless infants dependent on our caregivers for survival. The adult can withstand the storm of these emotions without being annihilated. By bravely facing the reality of our past, we transform the terrifying void of depression into a rich, complex, and intensely vital landscape, discovering that the freedom we have been endlessly searching for has been locked inside us all along. Chapter 7. The Inheritance of Disrespect. Imagine a warm, breezy evening on a crowded rooftop or a bustling neighborhood park. The worst of the day's heat has finally broken, and families have gathered to catch the evening wind. A young father is expertly flying a brightly colored paper kite, the glass-coated string pulled taut against the sky. His small son, barely 3 years old, watches with wide, mesmerized eyes. The boy desperately wants to hold the heavy wooden spool. He reaches his small hands out, his face lit up with eager anticipation. But as his fingers brush the wood, the father casually lifts the spool high above his head, entirely out of reach. The father smiles, a teasing glint in his eye, and says playfully, "No, you are too little. You will let it fly away." The boy jumps, his face crumpling into a mask of frustration, and begins to cry. Hearing the commotion, the mother walks over. Instead of comforting him, she leans against her husband and begins to laugh at the boy's helpless, red-faced outrage. "Look at him," she chuckles, "making such a fuss over nothing." To the adults, this is a harmless, endearing moment of family teasing. They are not cruel people. They provide for their son, keep him safe, and love him. But let us shift our perspective and experience this exact moment from the inside of that 3-year-old's mind. To him, this is not a joke. It is a profound and devastating humiliation. He is standing at the feet of 2 towering giants who hold all the power, all the resources, and all the control in his universe. In his moment of intense desire and subsequent frustration, he has no advocate. He is entirely alone. What is worse, these 2 giants have formed a united wall against him, and they are actively deriving amusement from his absolute powerlessness. They are mocking his smallness. In that moment, he learns a brutal lesson about power. The strong are allowed to dictate reality, and the weak must simply swallow their shame. Why do otherwise loving adults behave with such a stunning lack of empathy in these everyday moments? Why is a child's helpless frustration so frequently a source of amusement for the grown-ups around them? We can only unravel this mystery if we are willing to look at these towering parents not as powerful giants, but as insecure, unhealed children themselves. Deep within the psyche of that laughing father and mother are the buried memories of their own childhood humiliations. They too were once small, helpless, and mocked by the giants in their lives. But because the pain of that early powerlessness was too terrifying to process, they repressed it. Now, decades later, they have finally found a creature smaller and weaker than they are. By teasing the child, by controlling the source of his joy, and laughing at his tears, they are unconsciously medicating their own hidden wounds. The exercise of power over someone smaller is the ultimate defense mechanism. It allows the adult to project their own despised, split-off weakness onto the child, leaving the adult feeling wonderfully, intoxicatingly strong. This is the silent, insidious way that contempt is inherited. Disrespect for the weak is not a sign of strength. It is the absolute weapon of the fragile. It is the heavy, invisible inheritance passed down from one generation to the next, precisely because it is never consciously acknowledged. 20 years from now, that little boy crying on the rooftop will likely find himself holding something precious just out of the reach of his own child, laughing as history blindly repeats itself. Because he was not allowed to safely express his anger at being humiliated, he will be compelled to discharge that pent-up humiliation onto the only target society allows, his own offspring. The unrestrained, covert exercise of power over a child's spirit is entirely normalized in our world. We call it consistency in upbringing, or teaching them a lesson, completely ignoring the devastating emotional toll it takes on the developing self. And this rationalization becomes even more entrenched when the abuse is severe. Consider the countless adults who suffered intense physical or emotional terror at the hands of their caregivers. You will often hear a successful, highly educated person say with absolute pride, "My father was extremely strict. He beat me when I stepped out of line, but it taught me respect. It made me disciplined, and it is the reason I am successful today." They speak of their abusers with shining eyes, proudly recounting how they learned to suppress their tears to avoid further punishment. This is the tragedy of idealization. To survive the absolute horror of being beaten or emotionally terrorized by the person who is supposed to love you most, a child must completely warp their own reality. They cannot afford to believe that their parent is cruel or out of control. If the parent is bad, the child's entire universe is unsafe. So the child decides that they are the one who is bad, and the parent is a righteous, necessary force of correction. They idealize the abuser. But this survival mechanism has a catastrophic cost. When that child grows into an adult, they cannot recognize cruelty for what it is. Cruelty was the very air they breathed, disguised as love and discipline. Because their true suffering remains locked in the darkness of the past, completely inaccessible to their conscious emotions, they have no defense against passing it on. They will enforce the exact same terrifying discipline on their children, absolutely convinced they are doing it for the child's own good. The forms of this inherited disrespect are endlessly creative. It does not always look like physical violence. It can look like the subtle, patronizing irony a mother uses to shame her teenager's changing body. It can look like a father demanding that his daughter perfectly recite a poem for his guests, treating her as a possession to enhance his own prestige. It looks like the suppression of a child's natural curiosity under the guise of formal education, cutting off the living root of their spontaneity and then wondering why they lack the motivation to learn. In all these instances, the adult is actively using the child to manage their own unhealed anxieties. We cannot break this vicious circle simply by reading parenting books or making intellectual vows to be better than our parents. An intellectual promise is utterly powerless against the sheer, magnetic force of a repressed childhood trauma. The compulsion to repeat the past operates on a cellular level. It is driven by the agonizing, unfelt pain of the child we once were. The only way to stop passing the heavy stone of contempt down to the next generation is to finally sit down and feel its crushing weight ourselves. We must become exquisitely sensitive to the fine, subtle ways we were humiliated. We must dare to feel the rage, the profound unfairness, and the agonizing helplessness we experienced when the giants in our lives misused their power. When we finally allow ourselves to mourn our own history, we stop needing a scapegoat. We stop needing to feel big at the expense of someone small. And in that beautiful, difficult moment of emotional honesty, the chain of disrespect is finally broken and true protective empathy for the next generation is born. Chapter 8. The Hidden Chains of Repetition. There is a baffling and painful mystery that haunts almost all of us at some point in our adult lives. We watch our brilliant, capable friends repeatedly fall into relationships with people who treat them terribly, choosing the exact same type of emotionally bankrupt partner over and over again, simply wearing a different face. Or perhaps we look at our own lives and realize, with a sinking sense of dread, that we have once again sabotaged a moment of peace, once again fallen into an old destructive habit, or once again placed ourselves in a situation where we feel completely invisible and humiliated. From the outside, this looks like senseless self-destruction. It defies all logic and intellect, but within the deep, shadow-filled architecture of the human psyche, this behavior makes perfect, tragic sense. It is driven by one of the most powerful forces in the mind, the compulsion to repeat. Imagine a person who possesses a deep, beautiful well of emotional intelligence. Someone who longs profoundly to be understood. Yet, with the eerie infallibility of a sleepwalker, they manage to seek out and fall deeply in love with a partner who is fundamentally incapable of offering emotional warmth or empathy. The person pours their heart out, attempting to explain their deepest fears and highest hopes, perhaps writing long, vulnerable letters, only to be met with cold intellectual distance or blank incomprehension. When they finally realize that they are pouring their soul into a void, a crushing, agonizing wave of shame washes over them. They feel ridiculous, exposed, and deeply humiliated, as if they are a silly child standing alone in a room, tearfully explaining their heart to a blank brick wall. This agonizing scenario is not an accident of fate, nor is it simply a streak of bad luck in love. It is a highly orchestrated, unconscious attempt to recreate a specific trauma from the past. The individual is drawn to this emotionally unavailable partner precisely because that blank, unyielding coldness is deeply, intimately familiar. It is the exact emotional climate of their early childhood. Perhaps they had a caregiver who, due to their own unhealed wounds, was physically present but emotionally entirely absent. A caregiver who felt like a wall. The adult, driven by a desperate, unconscious hope, returns to the scene of the crime. They recreate the dynamic of the unresponded to infant, desperately trying to make the wall finally speak, to make the unloving parent finally understand. The burning shame they feel in the present is actually the ancient, repressed agony of the isolated child, finally surfacing to be felt. But the compulsion to repeat weaves even darker, more hidden chains. It extends far beyond our choice of romantic partners into the most private, secretive corners of our behavior, manifesting in deep compulsions, intense obsessive habits, and behaviors that society often judges with harsh condemnation. To understand the root of these hidden behaviors, we must once again travel back to the nursery. Picture a toddler in the full, vibrant swing of early discovery. They are messy, they are exploring their own bodies, they are feeling the sudden, fiery rush of an innocent tantrum when they are misunderstood. These are the most natural, healthy impulses of a human being coming alive. Now, imagine a caregiver reacting to this raw life force with absolute, panicked disgust. Imagine the mother or father looking at the child's natural behavior with widened, horrified eyes displaying deep shock, aversion, and indignation. Under the crushing weight of those horrified eyes, the child is paralyzed. They learn in an instant that a vital beating piece of their life force is fundamentally dirty, wicked, and unacceptable. Because a child cannot survive without the caregiver, they cannot challenge this verdict. Instead, they take this vibrant, unacceptable part of themselves and lock it away in the deepest, darkest cellar of their mind. They adapt completely to the pristine demands of their environment, developing a highly functioning false self that the world applauds. But the true self does not simply die in the dark. It mutates. It survives underground, in a state of perpetual torment, living in the exact same conditions as the child once did under the caregiver's disgusted gaze. Years later, this buried true self demands to be felt. It forces its way to the surface through intense compulsions and secretive habits. The adult finds themselves driven to perform actions that they themselves might find shameful or absurd. Unconsciously, they are arranging their lives to recreate the exact climate of their childhood trauma. They are desperately seeking that original condition of shame, trying to provoke the horrified eyes of the world or their partners, hoping that if they replay the terrifying scene one more time, they might finally find a way to master the pain. The compulsion is not a moral failure, and it is not a sign of depravity. It is a profound, tragic communication from the wounded inner child using the only language it has left. We cannot break these heavy chains of repetition with abstract logic, moral willpower, or the harsh punishments of society. Telling a person to simply exercise more control over a deep compulsion completely ignores the desperate, hidden plea wrapped inside the behavior. The mind cannot be healed by simply outlawing the symptom. The heavy machinery of the compulsion only grinds to a halt when the individual finally traces the behavior back to its origin, when they can bravely stand in the presence of that original, terrifying memory, when they can look at the horrified eyes of their past and finally feel the righteous anger and deep grief of the innocent child who was so unfairly shamed. The spell is broken. By truly understanding the source of the pain, the adult realizes they no longer have to recreate the nightmare. The story has been told, the grief has been honored, and the invisible chains simply dissolve into the light of awareness. Chapter 9. Society's Invisible Wounds. When we look out at the immense, churning complexities of our world, the rigid ideologies, the bitter social divisions, the unyielding systems of hierarchy and power, we often search for explanations in politics, history, or economics. We try to solve the pain of our communities with intellectual debates and sweeping policy reforms. But the heaviest, most unbreakable chains of any society are not forged in parliaments or corporate boardrooms. They are forged in the quiet, hidden spaces of our childhood homes. Society does not enforce its deepest, most restrictive constraints on an individual through public laws. It enforces them directly through the anxious, watchful eyes of a primary caregiver. Before a child can even speak, before they can comprehend the concept of a community or a nation, they learn the absolute rules of survival from the adults who hold them. Imagine a child growing up in a large, traditional joint family where harmony, duty, and respect for the elders are valued far above individual expression. The child learns, through the sudden stiffening of a parent's posture or a sharp, fearful glance, that standing out, asking too many questions, or showing unbridled emotion is a dangerous threat to the family's fragile peace. The parent, acting as an unconscious agent of society, enforces these unwritten rules not out of malice, but out of their own unhealed fears. The oppression of the human spirit, the demand for absolute compliance, begins in these very first weeks and months of life. Fast forward 20 or 30 years, and this child is now an adult navigating the modern world. Beneath their polite, highly functioning exterior, they are carrying a vast subterranean reservoir of unfelt rage from having their spirit continuously cramped and drilled to fit an impossible mold. Because it is entirely unacceptable, even life-threatening to their deep psychological structure, to direct this rage at the parents they still idealize, the fury must find a socially acceptable outlet. This is exactly how rigid, exclusionary ideologies are born and fiercely sustained. The adult seeks out and joins groups that demand absolute loyalty and offer clear, easily identifiable enemies to fight. The immense, passionate anger they project onto a rival political party, a different social class, or a competing community is actually the redirected, desperate fury of a mistreated child. By discharging their hatred onto innocent scapegoats, they protect the idealized image of their caregivers, allowing the ancient cycle of dependency and submission to simply shift to a new leader or a new political cause. This displaced pain also shapes the highest echelons of our society, manifesting as the profound, icy loneliness of the contemptuous. We often marvel at the towering figures of industry, the brilliant entrepreneur, the untouchable magnate, who seem to look down upon the ordinary world with a thinly veiled sneer. Imagine such a man standing in his air-conditioned, glass-walled office high above a sweltering, chaotic street filled with auto-rickshaws, street vendors, and the relentless, noisy hum of daily survival. He looks at the people swarming below and feels a distinct, cold superiority. He convinces himself that they are simply less driven, less intelligent, and fundamentally less worthy than he is, believing that his massive success makes him a superior breed of human. But this grand contempt is not a sign of immense strength. It is a desperate, impenetrable shield against his own unbearable vulnerability. By despising the average person, by holding the world in contempt, he protects himself from a devastating realization. If he were to step out of his high tower and walk among the crowd, if he were to admit that he is just a fragile, ordinary human being like everyone else, he would have to face the agonizing fact that his extraordinary achievements are the only reason he was ever valued. He despises weakness, failure, and helplessness in others because he absolutely despises the weak, helpless child that still lives within himself. As long as he maintains his grandiose contempt, he never has to mourn the heartbreaking truth that he was not loved simply for existing. The walls of contempt keep a person safe from the terrifying reality of their past, but they guarantee a future of absolute isolation. We cannot heal the deep, bleeding divisions in our society through intellectual arguments alone, because the root of this division is fiercely emotional. The future of a truly compassionate, free society depends entirely on our individual courage to dismantle our own inner towers. When we finally dare to experience the legitimate pain of our own childhoods, when we mourn the respect and unconditional love we were denied, we lose the desperate need to despise others. We realize that the people we have been fighting, dismissing, and looking down upon from our lonely heights are carrying the exact same invisible wounds, waiting just like us to finally be seen, understood, and brought back down to earth. Chapter 10. The Path to Authentic Freedom. We have traveled a long, demanding road together, descending into the quiet, often unlit spaces of the human heart. We have examined the heavy armor we built to survive, the illusions we mistook for love, and the hidden chains of repetition that bind so many lives to a painful, unacknowledged past. It can feel daunting to look at these truths, to finally turn around and face the very things we have spent our entire adult lives running away from. But the purpose of this profound inner journey is never to trap you in the past. The goal is to safely gather the scattered, exiled pieces of your true self and bring them forward into the light of the present. When a person finally dares to emotionally work through the unspoken history of their early years, a magnificent transformation occurs. They regain a raw, undeniable sense of truly being alive. For so long, the search for relief leads us outward. We desperately look for flawless mentors, charismatic leaders, or perfect communities to provide the absolute certainty and unconditional acceptance we never received. But a person who has bravely navigated the tragedy of their own fate no longer needs to be rescued. When you learn to clarify your own feelings and trace them back to their true origins, you develop an exquisite internal compass. You will no longer be easily deceived by empty, manipulative, or seductive words, because you have already seen through the most powerful manipulation of all, the one that occurred in your own childhood home. You realize that no one else can dictate your path. The decisions of how to live, who to love, and what to believe become entirely your own, born out of conscious, liberated choices rather than the blind compulsion to repeat. Consider what this freedom actually looks like as it unfolds in a single quiet life. Picture an older man, a revered elder in his family, sitting on the shaded veranda of his home as the late afternoon sun casts long golden shadows across the courtyard. He is watching his young granddaughter run wildly through the garden, her laughter ringing out loud and completely uninhibited. Suddenly, she trips, falls hard, and begins to wail. For a fleeting second, the older man feels a familiar, ancient tightening in his chest. His initial instinct, the instinct drilled into him by his own strict, unforgiving parents, is to silence her, to tell her sharply to stop making a scene, to demand that she act bravely. The ghost of his own father's harsh discipline rises in his throat. But this man has done the quiet, agonizing work of looking into his own past. He remembers the terrifying loneliness of being a small boy whose tears were met with sharp rebukes and absolute coldness. He allows himself to feel the brief, sharp sting of that old grief, honoring the boy he once was. And because he does not run from his own pain, he does not have to run from hers. He takes a deep breath, lets the ghost fade, and walks over to his granddaughter. He kneels down in the dust, wraps his arms around her, and simply lets her cry against his shoulder until the storm passes. In that incredibly ordinary, monumental moment, a multi-generational chain of inherited disrespect shatters into 1,000 pieces. He does not use his power to intimidate a weaker creature. He uses his strength to provide an absolute, unshakable sanctuary. This individual choice, multiplied across millions of lives, is the very foundation of a compassionate, free world. As long as we refuse to face the terror and helplessness we endured when we were small, we will unconsciously demand that society provide us with scapegoats to carry our unacknowledged rage. Illegitimate hatred, born from repressed childhood trauma, poisons the mind and completely blinds the capacity for compassion. It creates a world that endlessly arms itself, building towering defenses and rigid hierarchies to ward off an intimidation that actually happened decades ago in the nursery. But when we face the truth without the heavy veil of idealization, we stop needing to displace our hatred onto the innocent. We become capable of fiercely hating what is genuinely harmful and fiercely loving what truly deserves love. The body never forgets the truth of our history. The pain we repressed is stored deep within our cells, dictating our anxieties, our depressive moods, and our physical exhaustion. But the miraculous, empowering reality is that these deeply entrenched symptoms lose their grip the moment the traumatic experiences are no longer shrouded in darkness. Consciously experiencing our legitimate emotions does not destroy us. It completely frees us from the exhausting labor of self-deception. It opens our eyes to the present reality, stripping away the lies and illusions that kept us trapped. Imagine the world we can build when we stop sacrificing our children's vital inner lives for the sake of our own comfort. A child whose integrity is fiercely protected from their very first breath, who is respected, listened to, and loved for exactly who they are, grows into an adult of extraordinary sensitivity and intelligence. Because they were never forced to bury their true selves in a dark cellar, they do not walk through the world feeling empty or desperate for external validation. They inherently protect the weak and meet the world with empathy. Because empathy is the only language they have ever known. They take profound pleasure in life, unburdened by the unconscious, exhausting task of warding off early intimidation. This is the great quiet revolution of the human spirit. It requires no grand stages, no public accolades, and no flawless performances. It simply requires the courage to sit in the stillness, to listen to the forgotten voice within, and to finally grant that voice the respect it was always owed. You are the sole author of your present. The invisible prison doors have been unlocked. All that remains is for you to step out, take a deep breath of the vital, unfiltered air, and walk confidently into the rest of your truly authentic life.